Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Imprint Knowledge Solutions. And as a part of Imprint IAS, I'm Varun Kula. And we'll be going through Bipin Chandra's book, India After Independence. We have covered the first chapter, right? But if you have any questions regarding the first chapter, do ask us. I'm going to do a brief revision of the chapter, right? So in case you have any questions, you can email us at imprintknowledgesolutions@gmail.com or call us at our numbers +91 6280 let's rise the first chapter, that is the introduction part. And we started with the quote by Robert Blackwell, who was the departing US ambassador in 2003. And he talks about that India is a pluralist society and it creates magic with democracy, right? And the rule of law, individual freedom, community relations, and diversity. And he says that it's a great place to be an intellectual and he wouldn't mind being born here 10 times to rediscover India. Okay, then obviously the chapter talks about the Indian independence, right? The twist was destiny, as Nehru pointed out, was the start of an epoch. And it was embodied with a new vision, the idea that the country commences its long march to overcome the colonial legacy of economic underdevelopment, gross poverty, and near total illiteracy. That the white prevalence of disease and stark social inequality and injustice would be now, put back in the future, and centuries of backwardness would be overcome. The promises of freedom struggle will be fulfilled. Right, but what were the basic goals, right? What were the basic goals? To preserve, consolidate, and strengthen India's unity, to push forward the making of the nation, the idea that the state can be both an instrument of development and of social transformation. And if you remember Granville Austin, he talks about the Indian Constitution being a social document. Right. So India's unity had to be strengthened by recognizing and accepting India's immense regional, linguistic, ethnic diversity. And the unity in diversity concept was very much imbibed by the leaders. India's national leaders basically, set out to build a secular society, right, undaunted by the partition of India and the ensuing riots. But the founders of Indian Republic had far-sightedness and commit themselves to the two major innovations of historical significance and nation building. They basically realized this one interesting thing, that India needs to be democratic as well as it needs to be having a civil libertarian society, despite the fact Indian people are illiterate. They rejected, Nehru himself rejected the rice bowl theory that the poor in an underdeveloped country would be more interested in a bowl of rice than democracy. What Nehru thought was that India would always, the poor would actually create a system for themselves and they would actually make, the Indian system, Indian democracy as a tool of their upliftment, right? And it was realized that given India's, diversity, a democratic political structure was necessary for national integration and bringing about social change because there are too many pulls and pressures, right? And obviously, the political stability also had to be ensured at that time, and the political leadership, right, was so visionary, right? The idea is that the personal caliber of her leaders in the chapter is actually emphasized. And that, it was not just the leaders of the Congress, the Jawaharlal Nehru, the Vallabhbhai Patels, right, but the Hindu communists like Shyama Prakash Mukherjee, B.R. Ambedkar, right, the anti-Dalit leader. We had Ajoy Ghosh, we had, C. Rajagopalacharya, right, who was a conservative, right, former participant of the Congress movement itself. And obviously, so that was the basic idea that India's survival and growth and democratic polity basically owes it to the leadership they had. And in time, even today, like if you think about it, now we don't have the same caliber of leaders, and today the question is, if not Modi, then who, right? So this was the summary of the chapter. Let's now begin the next chapter, right, from India After Independence, right, 1947 to 2000 by Bipin Chandra, Mridula Mukherjee, and Aditya Mukherjee. And, I advise everybody to buy this book. It is by Penguin Publications, right? And this is a must read, and I'll tell you this for a fact that every IS officer I've met has told me that this is their favorite book. Okay, so the chapter is Colonial Legacy. Let's start that chapter. Okay, so let's start with the next chapter, that is chapter number 2, the Colonial Legacy. And the first statement is that, the premise of this chapter. It says that India's colonial past has weighed heavily on her development, in her development since 1947. And that the British rule drastically transformed India, right? If I want to extrapolate on that, during Aurangzeb's time, that is 1707, when Aurangzeb died, India was perhaps the richest country in the world. And Peter the Great talked about the fact who was the king of Russia, right? The Tsar of Russia. He said that the commerce of the world is in fact the commerce of India, right? And during that period, we have, the majority of the exports are Indian or Chinese exports, right? But what happened during British rule, like A. Gander Frank talks about it, and he says that the development of the underdevelopment, right? And that is what happened during the British rule. Because India, operating within and as a part of the colonial framework, became inseparable from the process of underdevelopment, and it led to a recrystallization of colonial economic structure, which generated poverty and subordination to British, right? And there are some basic features of that. The first basic feature is the fact that colonialism led to complete but complex integration of India's economy with the world's capitalist system, but in a subservient position. Second, the British industry, basically forced a peculiar structure of production and an internal division of labor, and that was basically that India would export foodstuff and raw materials, jute, oilseeds, minerals, and import manufactured goods like biscuits to shoes to machinery to cars and railway engines. So giving an example of that, 1935 to 39, 68.5% of India's exports were food, drink, tobacco, and raw materials, while manufactured goods were 64.4%. So, you should be in your answer in case anybody was asking about what, the colonial structure, the economic colonization of India, you should definitely mention this data, right? Third, basic to the process of economic development is the size and the utilization of economic surplus. Now, Indian savings from 1914 to 1946 was only 2.75% of GNP, and which, if you look in today's number, it is around 25 to 33%, depending on which year you're looking at. And from 1971 to 75, which is mentioned in the book, is 12%. So furthermore, a large part of the saving surplus basically is appropriated by the colonial state and misspent. And the other part is by indigenous landlords and money lenders, right? So on and on, economic development was not possible because of the simple reason that the savings to investment ratio was very, very low, right? The fourth feature, right, of colonialism was a crucial role played by the state in determining other aspects. So what were the four aspects, if you think about them? The first is in policies were determined in Britain in the interest of Britain's economy. So instead of actually supporting Indian industries and agriculture, what happened was the colonial state imposed free trade in India and refused to give tariff protection to Indian industries. And on the other hand, if you remember, in the 1700s, what has happened in the Europe and in Britain was the fact that Indian muslin, that is even an Indian handkerchief, selling that would be an offense, and for which you could be sent to jail, right? So the idea was that British industry should be favored. Even the currency policy was manipulated by the government to favor the British industry. If you remember the civil disobedience movement, one of the points that Gandhi played and what Gandhi said was the fact that he wanted the pound to sterling ratio, the rupee to sterling ratio to be set at a certain price. So that itself tells you something about the colonial structure, right? And then the bulk of the revenue was absorbed by the military and civil administration. And in 1890, it was 50% of the central government's income, and 47-48, it stood for nearly 47%. So again, both years, I would say that that tells you something about. Then the other colonial legacy, if you want to just look into the example of the book, the number of direct to indirect taxpayers, right? The number of direct taxpayers even today is absurdly low. For the population of India, that's 125 crores, around 3 to 5 crore people actually pay direct income tax. In that time, in 46, 47, it was 3.6 lakhs only. And also the regressive taxation policy of India, which was basically, today we have, majority of the taxes on petrol. At that time, if you think about it, 16% of total tax revenue was salt tax, right? And 53% was land revenue. And Gandhi actually went, from Sabarmati to, Dandi beach to actually make salt. And that basically is something similar to what is happening today with petrol. Then colonial state basically made India backward. What it did was it basically became a fetter on India's agriculture and industrial development. The agrarian structure which was evolved was dominated by landlords and moneylenders, merchants, and the colonial state. Now, the colonial state is interested in land revenue and ease of collecting revenue. It is not really interested in improving agriculture. Right, the landlords and moneylenders thought that the fact it was easier to rack rent of tenants or sharecroppers, and money lending is much more profitable and safe rather than productive investment in land they owned. Landlords basically owned 70% of the land, right, and it resulted in a rich class of peasants, which basically just focused to buy more land or in turn into money lending, right. So that was the basic idea. Now, one of the most interesting features of the colonial agriculture was the landlessness. Landlessness was never there in Indian history. And it was only with the advent of Britishers that we have landless laborers. And they grew from 13% to 28% from 1871 to 1951. Then, if you think about what kind of, idea of, commercialization of agriculture, we might think that it will lead to capitalist farming or improvement of technology. But what happened was the better soil, the available water, and the resources were just diverted from food crops to commercial crops. And that led to famines from 1770 to 1943, right? And the famous example is the Bengal famine, in which more than 3 million people died. And when, Churchill was asked to actually help, right, he said, why hasn't Gandhi died? Now, the other examples would be there were 9.3 lakh iron plows in 1951, but the number of wooden plows were more than 31 million. Inorganic fertilizers were virtually unknown, right? Even the animal manure was wasted. And only 11% of the croplands were under improved seeds in 1938 and 39, and that too in commercial crops. There were only 9 agriculture colleges, so little was basically focused on agriculture education. Idea was that India's backwardness of agriculture was basically now it was not as if the industry was also not backward, right? There was a collapse of the handicraft industry right from the 1700s, and the idea was that cheaper imported manufacturers from Lancashire and Britain, basically together with the policy of free trade, basically was imposed on the country that is India. Now, the other colonial legacy is the high rural to urban ratio. Majority of India is rural, even today. And during that time, it was 82.3% of the population was rural, according to 1951. In 2011, it was nearly 69%, right? And if you look at the dependency on agriculture, it is a colonial legacy itself. 1901, 63.7% of Indians were, working in agriculture. This figure basically went up to 70%. Now, foreign dominated capital dominated internal trade as well as foreign, right? Industries were only concentrated in a few regions like Bombay or in Calcutta or in areas near the coal mines. Basically led to wide regional disparities in income, which obviously when the planning started after independence, it was a focus that backward areas should have industries. The other some people when they debate about the colonial state talk about the positives of the colonial state, and in that we have something which is known as the railways. And India had 65,000 miles of paved roads and nearly 42 million miles, or 42,000 miles of railway track. And what happened was there was an absence of the industrial revolution, but there was a commercial revolution. Railway lines were laid with a view to link India's inland raw material producing areas with the port of export and to promote the spread of imported manufacturers from the ports to the interior. What if you think about Indian railways, the British era railways, it was basically a private enterprise at public risk. The dividend was guaranteed to the British capitalists, and their investment was safeguarded and even increased every year. And if you remember, since till the last few years, we had a different railway budget, and that itself was basically done to give dividend to the government, right? And that was a colonial legacy, definitely. And then railway freight rates was also favored, so to favor imports and exports and to discriminate against internal movements of goods. Further, we had very few managerial and technical personnel which were non-Indian, and there were only 7 engineering colleges with 2,200 students. It was not as if other things were great, right? If you think about health care, there were only 10 medical colleges with 700 graduates and 27 medical schools with only 7,000 licentiates a year. During the 1940s, you would actually be lucky if you live till the age of 32. IMR was 175 to 190 per live births. Epidemics like smallpox, plague, cholera, dysentery, diarrhea, malaria, fevers, led to deaths of millions every year. Malaria nearly affected 1/4 of the population. But if you think about the impact of the colonial legacy, is the widespread pauperization of a country that was perhaps the richest in the world in the 1700s, especially the peasants and artisanry. There was visible poverty, extreme poverty, disease, and hunger. And this was there in the major famines that ravaged parts of India from the second half of the 19th century. In the last, if you think about the pre-independence time, in 1943, there itself was a famine in Bengal, right? So again, this was an issue. Then if you think about modern sanitation, right, it was only confined to areas where rich Europeans and Indians lived. Now, one of the most famous examples is my father talking about the CM of Punjab, and when he came and started living in modern quarters, he was confused what the toilet was for, right? And that was the case with every Indian in the beginning. The colonial state, the other thing something they have done, which is still there, I would say in much more prominent form than others, is the general education system. English is the common language for the entire country, but it has negatives, right? It creates a wide gulf. There is Bharat and there is India, right? There's the educated Englishmen, people who can speak in English, and on the other hand, there are the masses, right, which speak in vernaculars. The other thing it did was it prevented the fuller development of Indian languages and the spread of education to masses, because the emphasis of English made sure that the education system doesn't really create rational, logical, analytical faculty. What it did was it created learning by rote, memorization of text, and proof by authority. What it basically did was to create babus who were actually thinking and speaking English, right, but looked proud. And the major weakness was also the neglect of scientific and technical education. There was almost a total lack of concern for the education of girls. If you think about it, in 1951, only 8 out of 100 women were literate. The colonial characteristic, right, was quite paradoxical as well, right? That's the other feature I would like to talk about now. It was authoritarian and autocratic, but there was rule of law and a relatively independent judiciary. Right, but if you think about it, the court acted in a biased manner whenever the effort was made to bring a European to justice. Right, so take the example of the Ilbert Bill controversy in 1883, where an Indian judge was not allowed to try a European, and basically it was a paradox. Right, another paradox was the constitutional and economic concessions that kept on happening from 1858 to 1892 to 1909 to 1919. Right, from 1919, some Indians could actually vote, but only 3% of Indians could vote after the Montagu-Chelford reforms in 1919, and after the Government of India Act, only 15% could vote. Further, the other paradox is the fact that Britishers normally claim that we created India, that India is nothing but, if when we leave India, India would disintegrate, right? But at the same time, they basically set into motion contrary forces. They achieved political and administrative unification, but set motion contrary forces. They followed a policy of divide and rule. In that, I have a very interesting example that when the ICS exam was held and Subhash Chandra Bose was a candidate in that, he was asked to write an essay on British policy in India, and in one line he wrote divide and rule. What they did was basically they turned people against people, province against province, caste against class, right? Caste against caste, Hindus against Muslims, princes and landlords against the national movement, landlords against the peasants, anyone against anyone, if it led to them ruling over India. Britishers ruled, on the other hand, with another paradox. The Indian civil services members were recruited on merit. They were rule-bound, efficient, and actually honest. They developed traditions of independence, integrity, and hard work, and which is still there. But on the other hand, they're a rigid and exclusive caste. They have a conservative and a social outlook, which is, unlike of, which is required for democracy. What they have is, after 1947, when social and economic change was sought, the rigidity of the bureaucracy became a major obstacle. There is a topic on this that bureaucracy versus democracy. Bureaucracy runs on rigid rules, on hierarchy, right, on efficiency, right. On the other hand, a democracy wants people orientation, it wants change, it wants rapid development, it wants upliftment of people, right. So that was a major thing. On the other thing, the paradox was the top civil servants were honest. On the other hand, at low levels there was corruption, especially where there was scope. For example, the Public Works Department and irrigation. And in that, the wonderful example is by Ramchandra Guha's book, India After Gandhi, and in which he basically says PWD stands for plunder without danger. And the other areas are the Royal Army Supply Corps. They're still as corrupt as possible. The police in India is, actually one of the great bastions of colonial legacy itself. But if you think about something, I think which I will always compliment the Britishers for, was the fact that they made every effort to keep the armed forces apolitical. Nationalist newspaper, journals, and publications were prevented from reaching the soldiers' officers' mess. This tradition of the army being apolitical has remained to a large extent since, I think the only change has been V.K. Singh, right, who is a minister in the current government, and basically tells you that the army itself is not apolitical anymore in India. But it still is in comparison to, let's say, Pakistan, and where a military bureaucratic system rules over Pakistan, despite the fact it's a democracy, right, in name maybe. On the other hand, let's think about what the colonial legacy bequeaths us. The most interesting ending would be Rabindranath Tagore's. And basically, I guess he basically thought of the fact that partition might happen. And before his death in 1941, he wrote, "The wheels of faith will someday compel the English to give up the empire. But what kind of India will they leave behind? What stark misery? When the stream of their centuries' administration run dry as last, what a waste of mud and filth will they leave behind?" Right. So I think Rabindranath Tagore basically thought of the same problem that, when the administration will not be there, there will be chaos. And that was seen in the partition of India. Right. Okay, that was it from us. All right. And thank you so much for listening to us. If you have any questions, write to us at imprintknowledgesolutions.com. You can comment, right, and like and share this video, right. If you have any questions, you can even WhatsApp us at the number +916280187919. Thank you so much. Wonderful. If you right, and do like and share and subscribe.